respect shifts in one moment. Not loud, not obvious, just a quiet realization that something doesn't add up. For a long time, most people believe respect comes from ever being patient, being consistent, proving value over time. But then something happens. The same effort goes unnoticed. The same consistency gets ignored. And suddenly it becomes clear, respect was never about what was given, it was about what was allowed. That realization changes everything. He stops over-explaining, stops over-giving, stops trying to be understood by people who already decided how they see him. Instead of earning respect through effort, he starts defining it through boundaries. The way he speaks changes. The way he responds changes. The way he allows access changes. And without raising his voice or forcing control, the dynamic around him begins to shift. People who once overlooked him start paying attention, not because he asked for it, but because he stopped giving it away. In this video, we're breaking down the exact moment a Sigma male realizes respect isn't earned, it's taken through presence, boundaries, and controlled behavior. If you want to understand silent authority, psychological positioning, and how respect is actually built, subscribe to Silent Wise. And stay until the end, because the final insight explains why most people lose respect without ever realizing how it happened. He notices people respect confidence more than effort or kindness. Confidence shifts perception. Effort gets overlooked. Kindness gets normalized. For a long time, he believed consistency would speak for itself. Show up, do things right, treat people well, and respect would follow naturally. But reality doesn't always reward effort the way it promises. The same kindness that felt like strength begins to feel invisible. The same effort that required discipline becomes expected, not valued. And in that quiet observation, something starts to change. As interactions continue, patterns begin revealing themselves. People respond differently to confidence than they do to effort. A person who speaks with certainty is heard faster than one who explains carefully. Someone who sets a clear tone is respected more than someone who tries to be understood. It's not about fairness. It's about perception. Effort happens in the background, but confidence shapes what others see in the moment. And once that difference becomes visible, it can't be ignored. From that point, clarity replaces assumption. He stops measuring value by how much he gives and starts observing how others respond. The same actions produce different reactions depending on how they are presented. Fit without presence fades. Kindness without boundaries becomes expected. But confidence controlled, steady, intentional changes the entire dynamic. It doesn't demand respect, it creates it. Over time, this realization restructures his behavior. He doesn't stop being kind, and he doesn't reduce effort, but he stops relying on them to define his position. Instead, he aligns his presence with his actions. The way he speaks becomes more direct. The way he carries himself becomes more grounded. There is less need to explain, less need to prove. What he does remains the same, but how it is perceived changes. People begin responding differently without fully understanding why. The same person who once blended into the background now holds attention without asking for it, not because he became louder, but because he became clearer. Confidence replaced uncertainty. Presence replaced explanation. And that's when the shift becomes permanent. Respect is no longer something he waits for, it becomes something that forms naturally through how he presents himself. He realizes over-explaining makes others value him less. Over-explaining reduces impact. More words, less weight. What starts as clarity turns into dilution. He used to believe that explaining everything would prevent misunderstanding, add context, cover every angle, make sure nothing is misread. But the more he explained, the less his words seemed to hold. Conversations stretched longer than necessary. Points became repetitive, and instead of increasing respect, it slowly weakened how others perceived him. As interactions continue, the pattern becomes visible. When he speaks briefly, people listen. When he adds layers of explanation, attention fades. The difference isn't in the content, it's in the delivery. Short, clear statements create certainty. Long explanations create doubt. Others begin interpreting over-explaining as hesitation, as if he is trying to justify rather than state. That perception changes the dynamic. Instead of receiving his words as final, they start questioning them. From that point, clarity replaces excess. He begins reducing what he says to what is necessary. No repetition, no unnecessary detail, just the point. That shift changes how his words land. Each statement becomes more direct, more defined, harder to ignore. The absence of extra explanation forces others to take his words at face value. There's no space to reinterpret, no additional context to dilute the message. Over time, this approach builds consistency. Conversations become sharper, responses become faster. The need to prove understanding disappears. Instead of managing how others perceive him through explanation, he allows his presence to define it. That removes pressure from every interaction. What is said is enough. What is not said is intentional. People begin responding differently without realizing why. They listen more closely because there is less to process. They question less because there is no uncertainty in delivery. The same message that once felt negotiable now feels final. And that shift happens without raising his voice or adding force, just by removing excess. Eventually, the realization becomes clear. Respect is not built through how much you explain. It is built through how clearly you speak. And once that clarity replaces over-explaining, perception changes immediately. He sees that boundaries create respect, not constant availability. Boundaries define value. Availability reduces it. When he was always reachable, always responding, always present, nothing about his time felt rare. Access became expected. Messages were answered immediately. Invitations were accepted without thought. The more available he was, the less noticeable his presence became. What felt like consistency on his side translated into normality on theirs. And normality rarely creates respect. As interactions continue, the pattern becomes clear. The moments when he isn't available carry more weight than the moments when he is. Delayed responses get more attention than immediate ones. Limited access creates focus where constant access creates indifference. People begin adjusting their behavior based on availability. When something is always there, it blends into the background. When it becomes selective, it stands out. That shift reveals something important. Respect is not created by giving more, but by controlling access. From that point, behavior changes with precision. He stops responding to everything. He chooses when to engage instead of reacting automatically. Conversations become intentional. Time is no longer distributed without awareness. Some interactions are reduced. Others are removed entirely, not out of emotion but out of alignment. Boundaries are not announced, they are applied. And because they are consistent, they become understood without explanation. Over time, the effect becomes visible. People begin valuing the moments when he is present because they are no longer constant. Attention increases because access is not guaranteed. The same person who was once overlooked becomes noticeable simply by limiting availability. That change doesn't require force, it requires control. This approach also protects focus. Without boundaries, time is shaped by external demand. With boundaries, time is directed internally. That shift creates space for growth, for clarity, for movement without interruption. While others remain reactive, he becomes selective. Eventually, the realization becomes stable. Respect does not come from being everywhere, it comes from knowing where not to be. And once boundaries replace constant availability, the dynamic changes permanently. He understands that people test limits to see what they can get away with. Limits get tested quietly. Small pushes, subtle shifts. It rarely starts with something obvious, a delayed response, a slight change in tone, a boundary that gets ignored just a little. Most people overlook these moments because they seem insignificant, but he begins noticing a pattern. The behavior isn't random. It's exploratory. People don't always ask what they can do. They show it step by step, watching what is allowed. As interactions continue, the pattern becomes clearer. When a boundary is not reinforced, the next step goes further. What was once a small push becomes a repeated behavior. Respect isn't removed all at once, it erodes gradually. And each time something is allowed without response, the limit shifts. Others begin adjusting their behavior based on what they experience, not what is said. Words may define a boundary, but actions determine whether it exists. From that point, clarity replaces assumption. He stops expecting people to naturally respect limits. Instead, he observes how they respond to them. Do they adjust when something is reinforced, or do they push further when it is ignored? That response reveals more than intention. It reveals character. Patterns of behavior become predictable, and once they are predictable, they are easy to understand. Over time, his approach changes. He no longer explains boundaries repeatedly. He enforces them through action. Access is reduced. Engagement shifts. Responses change. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just consistency. and consistency is what creates structure. Others begin recognizing where the limits are, not because they were told, but because they were experienced. This shift changes the entire dynamic. Instead of reacting to behavior after it happens, he defines the space before it can repeat. People adjust because the environment changes. What is allowed becomes clear without explanation, and what is not allowed simply stops being possible. Eventually, the realization becomes permanent. Respect is not based on intention, it is based on limits, and those limits are not defined by what is said, but by what is enforced. He stops seeking approval and starts controlling his presence. Approval loses importance. Presence takes control. For a long time, subtle adjustments shaped how he interacted. Tone softened to be accepted. Words expanded to be understood. Actions aligned to meet expectations. None of it felt obvious. It felt normal. But over time, something becomes clear. The more approval is sought, the more it defines behavior. And when behavior is defined by others, presence loses its stability. As interactions continue, the pattern becomes visible. Approval creates dependence. Decisions get delayed, responses get filtered, and attention shifts outward instead of inward. Instead of acting from clarity, he begins noticing how often actions are influenced by how they will be received. That realization changes everything. The focus moves from being accepted to being aligned. What others think becomes secondary to what is consistent internally. From that point, behavior shifts with precision. He stops adjusting himself to match the environment and starts holding a stable position within it. Words become direct. Responses become measured. There is no need to overextend, no need to prove value, no need to maintain approval through constant engagement. Presence becomes controlled, not forced, not exaggerated, but steady. And that steadiness creates a different kind of signal. Over time, the effect becomes clear. People respond differently to someone who does not seek validation. There is less room to influence him, less ability to shift his behavior through approval or disapproval. That independence changes the dynamic. Instead of adapting to others, others begin adjusting around him. Not because he demands it, but because his presence remains consistent regardless of external feedback. This approach also removes internal friction. Decisions become faster because they are not filtered through approval. Actions become cleaner because they are not adjusted for perception. The same energy that once went into being accepted is now directed into being effective. Eventually, the realization becomes stable. Approval is no longer needed to confirm direction. Presence defines itself through consistency, not validation. And once that shift happens, respect begins forming naturally, not because it was requested, but because it is no longer dependent on being given. He limits access to his time, making his attention more valuable. Time becomes selective. Access gets filtered. Attention is no longer given freely. For a long time, availability felt like the right move. Respond quickly, stay present, be reachable whenever needed. But over time, something becomes clear. When time is always available, it stops being valued. When attention is constant, it becomes expected, and what is expected rarely creates respect. That realization shifts how he treats his time completely. As interactions continue, the pattern becomes obvious. The more available he is, the less intentional others become with his time. Conversations stretch without purpose. Requests appear without consideration. Attention is used, not valued. But when availability decreases, behavior changes. People become more focused, messages become more direct, interactions become more intentional. The same time that was once taken for granted now carries weight simply because it is limited. From that point, his behavior adjusts with precision. He doesn't respond to everything immediately. He chooses when to engage and when to stay unavailable. Not out of avoidance, but out of control. Conversations are shorter, more purposeful. Access is given based on alignment, not habit. The shift is quiet, but consistent, and consistency is what makes it effective. Over time, others begin recognizing that his attention is not automatic, it is chosen. This change creates a different dynamic. Instead of reacting to external demands, he directs where his time goes. That control removes unnecessary interaction and protects focus. Energy is no longer scattered across everything. It is concentrated on what matters, and that concentration increases effectiveness in everything he does. People begin responding differently without understanding why. They value the moments when he engages because they are no longer guaranteed. They listen more closely because his attention is not constant. The same presence that once blended into the background now stands out simply because it is controlled. Eventually, the realization becomes clear. Time is not just something to manage, it is something to protect. And when access to it is limited intentionally, its value increases automatically. He responds selectively, not reacting to everything anymore. Selectivity replaces impulse. Fewer responses, clearer choices. The shift is not in what happens around him, it's in what he chooses to engage with. For a long time, every message, every comment, every situation pulled a response. Reacting felt natural, almost automatic. But over time, something becomes obvious. Not everything deserves attention, and giving attention to everything weakens control. As interactions continue, the pattern becomes visible. The same triggers that once created immediate reactions now pass without response. A comment that once required clarification is ignored. A situation that once demanded explanation is left untouched. Others begin noticing the difference. The expected reaction doesn't come. The conversation doesn't extend. The cycle doesn't repeat. That absence creates a shift in the dynamic. Without reaction, there is nothing to feed off. From that point, control becomes intentional. He chooses when to respond and when to remain silent, not out of avoidance, but out of precision. Each response is placed where it matters. Everything else is filtered out. That filtering removes noise from his environment. While others react to everything, he reacts to what aligns. And that alignment creates consistency. Over time, this approach changes how others interact with him. People become more intentional because they know reactions are not guaranteed. Conversations become sharper because they are not filled with unnecessary exchange. The same environment that once felt chaotic becomes structured simply because he is no longer reacting to it. This shift also strengthens internal clarity. Without constant reaction, attention remains stable. Decisions are not influenced by every external input. Instead, they are guided by priority. That difference allows him to move with direction instead of distraction. Eventually, the realization becomes stable. Reaction is easy. Selectivity is control. And once that control is established, everything around him begins adjusting to it. He enforces standards silently, letting actions redefine how others treat him. Standards get enforced through action. No speeches, no repeated warnings, no need to explain what should be obvious. For a long time, standards were expressed in words, clear, direct, stated openly. But words alone don't define behavior. What is allowed becomes the real standard. And once he sees that, everything changes. He stops explaining expectations and starts reinforcing them through what he accepts and what he removes. As interactions continue, the shift becomes visible in small ways. A behavior that crosses a line is no longer addressed with discussion. It is met with distance. Access changes. Engagement reduces. The response is not emotional, not reactive, just different. Others begin noticing the pattern. When something aligns, the interaction continues. When it doesn't, it quietly stops. No confrontation, no escalation, just a consistent adjustment that reflects a clear standard. From that point, behavior around him begins adapting. People recognize what is allowed and what is not, without needing to be told repeatedly. The environment reshapes itself based on his responses. What once required explanation now becomes understood through experience. And because the enforcement is consistent, it becomes stable. There is no confusion, no mixed signals, just a clear boundary reflected in action. Over time, this approach creates respect without force. There is no need to demand it, no need to negotiate it. It forms naturally because the standard is not flexible. The way he engages becomes the message. The way he withdraws becomes the signal. Everything is communicated without being spoken directly. This also protects his position. By enforcing standards silently, he avoids unnecessary conflict. There is no argument to win, no explanation to defend. The decision is already made, and the action reflects it. That removes pressure from the interaction and keeps control entirely on his side. Eventually, the result becomes clear. People treat him based on what he allows, not what he says. And once that dynamic is established, it becomes difficult to change. Because standards enforced through action don't need reinforcement, they sustain themselves. Respect doesn't shift in one loud moment, it changes through quiet realizations. The moment he stops over-explaining, the moment he limits access, the moment he enforces standards without speaking, each small adjustment removes something unnecessary and replaces it with control. And over time, those shifts reshape how people see him without him needing to demand anything. Most people lose respect without realizing how it happened. Too available, too reactive, too focused on being understood instead of being clear. But the Sigma male reverses that pattern. He doesn't chase respect, he structures it through boundaries, presence, and selective action. And once that structure is in place, the dynamic around him changes permanently. If you want more insights into Sigma psychology, silent authority, and how real respect is built without force, make sure you subscribe to Silent Wise. And tell me in the comments, do you think respect should be earned through effort or controlled through boundaries and behavior?